Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
How can a company manage multiple AWS accounts and provide read-only access to a security team from a central location?
The solution is to use the Organization Account Access Role (IAM) role to create a new IAM role with read-only access in each member account. Then, establish a trust relationship between the IAM role in each member account and the security account for the security team to use.
In a hub-and-spoke design for AWS accounts, how would you enable private subnets in spoke VPCs to route internet traffic through an egress VPC?
I would create peering connections between the egress VPC and the spoke VPCs and configure the necessary routing to allow internet access.
How would you handle a situation where a web application experiences a spike in failed login attempts that overwhelm the authentication service?
I would create an AWS WAF Web ACL with a rate-based rule and set the rule action to block. Then I would connect the Web ACL to the application load balancer.
How would you migrate an on-premises SaaS solution that uses SFTP endpoints to AWS while minimizing operational overhead?
I would register the customer-owned block of IP addresses in the AWS account, create elastic IP addresses from that block, and assign them to an Amazon S3 VPC endpoint. Then, I would enable SFTP support on the S3 bucket.
How would you ensure high-throughput, low-latency network connections between 5 Amazon EC2 instances for a new application?
I would launch 5 new EC2 instances into a cluster placement group and ensure that the instance type supports enhanced networking.
How would you secure a REST API that is experiencing high traffic potentially from a botnet?
I would create an AWS WF Web ACL that allows access only to the IP addresses of the 6 partners. Then, I would associate the Web ACL with the API, create a resource policy with a request limit, and configure the API to require an API key for the POST method.
How can a company monitor all data activity on an Amazon Aurora PostgreSQL DB cluster?
The best solution is to set up an AWS Database Migration Service Change Data Capture task, specifying the Aurora DB cluster as the source and Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose as the target. This will allow the data to be uploaded into an Amazon Redshift cluster for querying and analysis.
How would you configure an auto-scaling group for an entertainment company that wants to dynamically scale its instance fleet based on CPU and memory consumption?
I would configure the auto-scaling group to deploy R6G.8x large memory optimized instances with a minimum capacity of 2, a desired capacity of 2, and a maximum capacity of 6.
How can a financial services company reduce costs associated with their Amazon DynamoDB table that experiences burst red activity?
I would recommend deploying an Amazon ElastiCache cluster in front of the DynamoDB table.
What steps would you take to resolve connectivity issues for a centralized logging service running on Amazon EC2?
I would check that the network access control list is attached to the logging service subnet to allow communications to and from the network load balancer subnets. I would also ensure that the security group for the logging service allows ingress from the NLB subnets.
How would you optimize costs for a company using Amazon S3 with increasing KMS request costs?
I would create a new S3 bucket with server-side encryption using customer-provided keys. Then, I would copy the existing objects to this new bucket.
What actions would you take to improve the performance and reliability of a media storage application that is encountering issues with photo processing due to Lambda concurrency limits and DynamoDB performance?
I would evaluate and adjust the right capacity units for the DynamoDB tables and add an Amazon Simple Queue service queue along with reprocessing logic between Amazon S3 and the Lambda functions.
How would you migrate an on-premises application that allows media file uploads to AWS while minimizing operational overhead?
I would use AWS Application Migration Service to migrate the application server to Amazon EC2 instances. I'd create an auto-scaling group for those instances and use an application load balancer to manage requests. Additionally, I would modify the application to use Amazon S3 for file storage and implement Amazon Cognito for user authentication.
How can a development team analyze application logs after EC2 instances scale in?
They can configure the EC2 instances to publish logs to Amazon CloudWatch logs using the unified CloudWatch agent.
What steps would you take to resolve a CoreS error when using an Amazon API gateway with a static website hosted on S3?
I would enable the CORS setting in AWS WAF and create a web ACL rule to set the access control allow origin header to www.example.com.
How would you centralize billing and management for multiple AWS accounts while using Azure Active Directory?
I would deploy AWS IAM Identity Center in the management account, connect it to Azure Active Directory, and set it up for automatic synchronization of users and groups. Additionally, I would deploy an AWS Managed Microsoft AD directory in the management account and share it with other accounts using AWS Resource Access Manager. Finally, I would create IAM Identity Center permission sets and attach them to the relevant groups and accounts.
What would be the most cost-effective solution for managing a group of infrequently used, business-critical applications on AWS?
The most cost-effective solution would be to deploy Amazon ECS containers on Amazon EC2 with auto-scaling configured for memory utilization of 75%. Each application would have an ECS task with scaling based on demand, and we would monitor everything using Amazon CloudWatch.
How would you minimize compute costs for an Amazon EMR cluster that runs critical tasks every morning?
I would continue to launch all nodes on on-demand instances, terminate the cluster when processing is done, and purchase compute savings plans to cover the on-demand instance usage.
How would you enable a legacy application on AWS to communicate with on-premises systems while ensuring automatic failure mitigation?
I would deploy 3 NAT gateways, one in each public subnet, and assign the elastic IP address to them. I would also turn on health checks for the NAT gateways, so if one fails, I can recreate it and assign the elastic IP address to the new gateway.
What steps would you take to move 540 developer accounts to a new AWS organization?
First, from each developer account, I would remove the account from the old organization using the remove account from organization operation. Then, I would call the invite account to organization operation from the new developer organization's management account to send invitations to those developer accounts. Finally, I would have each developer sign in to their account and confirm joining the new organization.
How can you integrate image corruption detection in an Amazon CloudFront distribution serving images from an S3 bucket?
I would recommend using a Lambda edge function that is invoked by an origin response event.
How would you automate the deployment process for an application running on EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group with minimal operational overhead?
I would create a new Amazon machine image that has the code deploy agent installed. Then I would configure the auto-scaling group's launch template to use this new AMI and associate the code deploy deployment group with the auto-scaling group instead of individual EC2 instances.
What steps would you take to design a highly available solution for a website running on EC2 instances behind an application load balancer?
I would delete the existing application load balancer and the EC2 instances. Then I would create an auto-scaling group configured for the web application traffic, attach a new launch template to it, create a new ALB, and attach the auto-scaling group to this new ALB. Finally, I would wait for the auto-scaling group to launch the minimum number of EC2 instances.
How would you optimize AWS data transfer and compute costs for developers in an organization using AWS?
I would create an AWS Service Catalog portfolio that allows users to create an approved VPC configuration with S3 gateway endpoints and approved EC2 instances. Then, I would share this portfolio with the developer accounts and set up a launch constraint using an approved IAM role, limiting developers' IAM permissions to only access the service catalog.
How would you recommend managing access to AWS resources across multiple accounts and regions for a company that is expanding?
I would suggest creating an organization in AWS Organizations, then creating IAM users for each account. I would attach a policy to each user to block access to regions where they cannot deploy infrastructure.
How would you refactor a retail ordering web application to create a decoupled and scalable architecture while minimizing operational costs?
I would use Amazon S3 for web hosting, along with Amazon API Gateway for database API services. For order queuing, I would implement Amazon Simple Queue Service. Finally, I would use Amazon Elastic Container Service for business logic, utilizing Amazon SQS long polling to retain any failed orders.
What additional step would you take to ensure cross-region data recovery for a web application hosted on AWS?
I would create a MySQL standby database on an Amazon EC2 instance in US West 2.
How can a company restrict specific AWS member accounts to certain regions for resource deployment?
A solutions architect can create an AWS config rule in the specific member accounts to limit the regions and apply a tag policy.
What actions would you take to remediate the security issue with public access to reports in an Amazon S3 bucket?
I would review the AWS Trusted Advisor bucket permissions check and implement the recommended actions.
How would you design a migration strategy for moving an Amazon RDS for Oracle database to an RDS for PostgreSQL DB instance in another AWS account without downtime?
I would configure VPC peering between the VPCs in the two AWS accounts to ensure connectivity between the database instances. Then, I would use AWS Database Migration Service to perform a full load plus change data capture migration from the source database to the target database. Finally, once the migration is complete, I would change the CNAME record to point to the target DB instance endpoint.
What would you do if an order message in an Amazon SQS standard queue was causing errors and blocking subsequent messages?
I would configure a new SQS FIFO queue as a dead letter queue to isolate the faulty messages.
How can a company improve its machine learning model retraining workflow to ensure notifications are sent for all types of failures?
The solutions architect should create a task named email that forwards input arguments to an Amazon SNS topic. Additionally, they should add a new email address to Amazon's simple email service and verify it. Lastly, they should create a task that forwards input to the verified SES email address.
How can a company ensure that a new private intranet service on Amazon EC2 instances can resolve host names in the company example DNS zone?
The solution is to create an empty private zone in Amazon Route 53 for company.example and add an NS record to the on-premises zone, pointing to the Route 53 name servers.
How would you limit traffic between multiple VPCs in a scenario where a security audit reveals unrestricted communication between them?
I would create a dedicated transit gateway route table for each VPC attachment and route traffic only to the authorized VPCs.
How would you rehost a Windows-based desktop application on AWS for a company that has employees using Linux machines?
I would refactor and containerize the application to run as a web-based application. Then I would run it in Amazon Elastic Container Service on AWS Fargate with step scaling policies and implement authentication using Amazon Cognito user pools. Employees would access the application through their browsers.
What cost-effective solution would you propose for querying data collected from IoT devices stored in HDFS?
I would recommend storing the data in Amazon Redshift and using it to query the data.
What strategy would you recommend for a company that needs better visibility into AWS billing and cost management, especially for untagged resources?
I would recommend using an AWS config rule to alert the finance team about untagged resources. Additionally, I would create a centralized AWS Lambda solution to tag any untagged RDS databases and DynamoDB resources every hour using a cross-account role.
How can a company send data from its on-premises systems to Amazon S3 buckets across different accounts without using the internet?
The company should establish a networking account in AWS, create a private VPC there, and set up an AWS Direct Connect connection with a private virtual interface between the on-premises environment and the VPC. Additionally, they should create an Amazon S3 gateway endpoint in the networking account.
What would be the most cost-effective solution for a company looking to reduce its DynamoDB costs while operating quick-service restaurants?
The most cost-effective solution would be to reduce the provisioned read and write capacity units.
How can a company improve user engagement by reducing comment latency in their blog post application hosted on AWS?
The best solution is to use AWS AppSync and leverage WebSockets to deliver comments in real time.
How can a company ensure that S3 access points are only created within VPCs?
The most efficient way is to set the S3 access point resource policy to deny the create access point action unless the access point network origin condition key evaluates to VPC.
After deploying an application in a new environment within AWS Elastic Beanstalk, what should be done next to complete the update?
You should redirect to the new environment using Amazon Route 53.
What design would you implement for an image service that allows users to upload and search for photos?
I would store the uploaded images on a shared Amazon Elastic Block Store volume mounted to a fleet of Amazon EC2 Spot instances. I would also create an Amazon DynamoDB table to track the status of each uploaded image. Additionally, I would use an Amazon Event Bridge rule to scale the EC2 instances and enable Amazon CloudFront, configuring the origin to reference an Elastic Load Balancer in front of the EC2 fleet.
How would you ensure low latency and real-time data access for customers in Europe and the US using an Amazon RDS for MySQL instance?
I would add a cross-region replica in EU West 1 for the RDS for MySQL instance and configure it to replicate write queries back to the primary DB instance. Then I would deploy the application in EU West 1 and configure it to use the RDS for MySQL endpoint in that region.
How would you improve the availability of an SFTP server running on a single Amazon EC2 instance while minimizing disruption to customers?
I would disassociate the Elastic IP from the EC2 instance and create an Amazon Elastic file system for SFTP file hosting. Then I would set up an AWS Fargate task definition to run the SFTP server and specify the EFS as a mount. I would create a Fargate service with a network load balancer in front of it and attach a security group with customer IP addresses. Finally, I would associate the Elastic IP with the NLB and sync all files from the SFTP server to the S3 bucket.
What would be the most cost-effective solution for a company that ingests and processes streaming market data, considering their current architecture?
The most cost-effective solution would be to update the ingestion process to use Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose to save data to Amazon S3. Then, a scheduled script could launch EC2 on-demand instances each night to perform batch processing of the S3 data and terminate the instances once processing is complete.
How would you migrate an on-premises SFTP site to AWS while ensuring high availability?
I would create an AWS Transfer Family server with a publicly accessible endpoint. The server would place files into an Amazon Elastic file system that spans multiple availability zones. I would also modify the downstream applications to mount the EFS endpoint instead of the existing NFS share.
How would you adopt a new availability zone for an operational workload in an autoscaling group without adding additional IPv4 address space and without service downtime?
I would update the autoscaling group to use the AZ2 subnet only, then adjust the AZ1 subnet to half its previous address space. After that, I would include the AZ1 subnet in the autoscaling group again. Once the instances are healthy, I would switch back to using the AZ1 subnet only. Next, I would update the AZ2 subnet to take the second half of the address space from AZ1 and create a new AZ3 subnet using half of the original AZ2 address space. Finally, I would update the auto-scaling group to target all 3 new subnets.
How can a company enforce the use of project tags for new resources in AWS with minimal effort?
The company can create a tag policy with allowed project tag values in the AWS management account. Then, they can create an IAM policy that denies the create stack operation unless a project tag is included, and assign that policy to each user.
How would you reduce EC2 costs and increase utilization for an application running in an auto-scaling group with underutilized instances?
I would analyze the application's CPU and memory utilization to select a suitable instance type. Then I would modify the auto-scaling group's configuration to add the new instance type and remove the old one.
What disaster recovery strategy would you implement for a containerized application using Amazon ECS and API Gateway, with an RPO of 2 hours and an RTO of 4 hours?
I would set up an Aurora Global Database and DynamoDB Global Tables to replicate the databases to a secondary AWS region. Then, I'd configure an API Gateway API with a regional endpoint in both regions and implement Amazon CloudFront with origin failover to route traffic during a disaster recovery scenario.
What actions would you take to increase the cache hit ratio for a web application using Amazon CloudFront?
I would deploy a Lambda edge function to sort the query parameters by name and convert them to lowercase using the CloudFront Viewer request trigger to invoke the function.
How would you replicate data from an Amazon Aurora MySQL DB cluster to another region to meet disaster recovery requirements?
I would use AWS Database Migration Service to create a change data capture task that replicates ongoing changes from the Aurora database to an Amazon S3 bucket in another region.
How would you make a company's application highly available while addressing its performance issues?
I would create a new Amazon machine image configured with the AWS Systems Manager agent. Then, I would use this AMI to create a launch template for an auto-scaling group with smaller instances. An application load balancer would distribute traffic across those instances, and the auto-scaling group would scale based on CPU utilization. Finally, I would migrate the database to Amazon Aurora MySQL.
How can a company identify the dependencies that need to be migrated together with an application to AWS, especially when they are unsure of all the dependencies?
The company should use AWS Migration Hub to select the servers hosting the application. They can visualize the network graph to find interacting servers and enable data exploration in Amazon Athena. By querying the data transferred between the servers, they can identify those communicating on port 1000 and then create a move group based on these findings.
How would you implement a request quota system for an application running on AWS Lambda that serves hundreds of customers?
I would create an Amazon API Gateway REST API with a proxy integration to invoke the Lambda function. For each customer, I would configure an API Gateway usage plan that includes the appropriate request quota and create an API key from the usage plan for each user.
What would be the best solution to migrate a VMware cluster with many VMs and an NFS server to AWS in the least amount of time?
I would configure AWS Application Migration Service with a connection to the VMware cluster, create a replication job for the VMs, and set up an Amazon Elastic file system. Then, I would use AWS Data Sync to copy the NFS server data to the EFS file system over the Direct Connect connection.
How would you ensure that sensitive data in an online survey application running on AWS is encrypted while being processed?
I would create an RSA key pair dedicated to the data handling microservice, upload the public key to the CloudFront distribution, and then create a field-level encryption profile and configuration to add to the CloudFront cache behavior.
What DNS strategy would you recommend for a VPC that needs to support private hosted zones and public host names for instances with public IPs?
I would create a private hosted zone and associate it with the VPC. Then I would activate the Enable DNS support and enable DNS host names attributes for the VPC. Finally, I would create a new VPC DHCP options set, configuring it to use Amazon-provided DNS and associate that with the VPC.
How would you handle unexpected bursts of usage in an Amazon Redshift cluster during intensive reporting tasks?
I would turn on the concurrency scaling feature for the Amazon Redshift cluster to accommodate the increased demand.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.